So I froze there. So I would say to a large extent, I'm hoping this is where I left off, I would say to a large extent, supply and demand fit in here. Trying to figure out whether people invest in or use effectively the factors of production. Hopefully, walk away from this class with an appreciation of the fact that the default human condition is poverty, and the fact that as bad as things may get here in these next few months, hopefully we've seen the worst of it at this point, but that compared to the default human condition and compared to most places around the world, we are amazingly fortunate. And again, my students in Iraq, when they discovered that the per capita GDP of around $12,000 a person, by the historical default human condition, they were immensely lucky. And even compared to most places around the world, they'd say, look, that $12,000 is pretty attractive. So we've got supply and demand. We've got gains from specialization and trade, why those happen. We've applied our tools to a whole variety of policies, whether it's minimum wages, whether it's subsidies, whether it's international trade with taxes, tariffs on trade and quotas, concerns that we might have with international trade. We've looked at sort of the two big picture, right? Don't forget, the two big picture questions of macroeconomics, in my view, are differential prosperity across time and differential prosperity across space. And that's going to be increasingly relevant today, right? This crisis is definitely going to change the economic prospects of a variety of areas, some of which are going to do relatively well and others are going to do relatively poorly. What else? Well, we looked at, international trade, as I mentioned. We looked at the balance of payments, the current account, the capital account. We've looked at exchange rates. We went back and looked at, in addition to the default human condition, GDP, what it is, what its shortcomings are, what it actually measures. What else did we look at? We looked at our solo model. And again, you should know what these pieces are, what the factors of production are. We spent time with the Fraser Index, looking at institutions, what they are, which rules matter. We spent some time talking about how institutions alter people's incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. So we looked at what this is, we looked at what these are, we looked at this link, we looked at this link, we looked at what these are. Then really the last chunk of time we zoomed in on this, and from there we went to our solo model to model exactly how are the factors of production turned into output. We subsequently, we started with the assumption that we were using all labor or a constant share of labor. We were assuming that all savings made it into investment, By the way, this is savings, not supply, We looked at interest rates, both nominal and real. Again, so basically you could say we started with the supposition that all labor was being used effectively, all savings made it into investment, and that nominal and real interest rates were the same. We then relaxed that assumption to talk about unemployment and the labor force participation rate. We relaxed this assumption to talk about how savings makes it into investment. In other words, our market for loanable funds. I know there's labor force and loanable funds. We talked about financial intermediation, the groups that are in here, banks primarily, bond markets and stock markets. We talked about the present value of money, So the present value is equal to the sum of discounted xt 1 plus r to the t, So we talked about where interest rates come from. We also then looked at how we dealt with inflation, the fact that nominal and real interest rates can diverge. What else did we talk about? I think we're getting most of the way there, Yeah. Then we looked at short-term business cycles. That was the last piece, right? The last piece was exchange rates, but realistically, the last piece here were some short-term business cycle theory. So hopefully that gives you some sense of how these fit together. Now, if we just sort of talk about maybe areas where we've seen interest rates, that would be our market for loanable funds, where here we have this. Areas where we've seen growth, that's another good one, percent change versus change. Here, we're talking about our solo model. We have Y and K, and depreciation and investment. Right? Let's see, what else? We've got consumption smoothing, right? And some idea of what that looks like. We have, as I've already talked about, what the unemployment rate is, what somebody unemployed is, and where we would put that in here. What else? I mean, we've covered a fair bit, but I'm hoping that you have some idea of how to use the tools. Now, it was a lot of them, right? And then we ended up, at the end here, adding in, we have inflation, and we have output, growth, and we have our aggregate demand, which again has nothing to do with demand. It is just all combinations of inflation and economic growth that is consistent with the left-hand side of that equation, or maybe left-hand side if you're looking at this, right? And in our real business cycle model where wages and prices adjust, this is our long-run aggregate supply, or our solo growth model. And in this model, what's driving fluctuations in economic growth in the short run are real shocks. Now, if those real shocks end up being changes to the institutions, then we could say, if this was a positive real shock, that if we reform the institutions, our long-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. On the other hand, there's going to be some things like our current predicament where probably what will happen is our aggregate supply in the short run, there will be a real negative shock, it'll shift to the left, and then eventually it'll shift back to the level that is driven by institutions. Again, it's possible to have these short-term fluctuations. They're only going to become long-term aspects of the economy if they really operate up here. By the way, as I mentioned unemployment. Another thing we would want to understand, hopefully you remember from unemployment, are the types of unemployment and what they mean. Right? So this is our real business cycle model where real shocks to the economy are what are driving changes here. Of course, our new Keynesian model says, so we have our short-run aggregate supply schedule, we have our long-run aggregate supply schedule, big dot, we have our aggregate demand schedule. So this would be our new neo-Keynesian model, where it takes a little while for wages and prices to adjust, and so a nominal shock can actually have a short-run reduction in economic output, and eventually, however, we would expect contracts to be renegotiated, and we would end up back at a lower level of inflation and the same level of economic growth. So I hope you're walking away with, and if not, I think we can hopefully chat about this in our last session together. These are a lot of tools, and I hope you understand how they pull together. How we can take all of the pieces, whether we talked about unemployment or inflation or other things, and talk about how that will affect people's incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. I hope you understand what shifts our supply of loanable funds and our demand for loanable funds, right? I'm hoping you're walking away with a lot of pieces here. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, and I won't spend too much more time on this, I think hopefully you have some sense of these tools and how they apply, and I'm hoping that we don't have to spend too much time on the why do I care question. I mean, basically, my sense is that you don't know the answers to what's happening in the economy because nobody does. But you have better questions and you can participate in the discussion. You understand what the models are. You understand whether people understand what they're saying really in this sense or not, that you can participate in that debate. You can agree with people. You can disagree with people in a reasoned fashion other than I like it or I don't like it. One thing, though, that I would want to say that I want to leave you with here is discouraging aspect, and I've mentioned this before, discouraging aspect to me of research on the impact of economic education is that it tends to, the consensus is that people who study economics may be more selfish. Now, there's questions about how do you measure that. There's some methodological questions there. But if that's true, I'm concerned because that's not what I take away from economics. Now, if it's the case that people who are more selfish or more self-centered are attracted to economics in the first place, I find that troubling because, again, what I'm trying to understand is social coordination, not how to get more stuff. Now, this system of social coordination can take people who are otherwise very self-centered and take them and still turn them into a productive member of society. But it is not a statement that we need more self-centered or selfish people. On the other hand, if people come in and economics is the general discipline that people deal with, and they walk out of it feeling like selfishness is a good thing, I think we've also done a disservice to society. Again, what we are trying to understand is social coordination and human flourishing, not individual selfishness. But again, in order to understand that, oftentimes we need to step beyond what we think and have a framework for stepping outside of ourselves, right? To a realm where intentions aren't enough, right? Because we can posit that there are good intentions for many policies. Now, I'm not sure that that's true, but I'm willing to countenance that, right? I'm willing to say, okay, the reason why we have minimum wages is people care about the poor. But minimum wages, almost certainly we would expect, make the poor worse off. The few poor people who get a job, that's great, except for they're probably going to be worse off, right? Rent controls. Maybe they're put in place to keep the poor from being priced out of the housing market. But at the end of the day, what they result in is fewer low-price apartments. And so basically, I hope you have some understanding of the role of unintended consequences. So in our personal lives, we tend to think that intentions matter, and I think for good reason, right? If a close friend of mine really tried and wanted to hurt me, but in the process ended up actually helping me, that would be concerning because I have friends who want to hurt me. And by the same token, if we had a friend who wanted to help me and they ended up creating damage in the process, we say, look, intentions matter in what we would call the intimate order. But if we're going to coordinate millions and billions of people, we can't rely on intentions. And oftentimes, in this complicated ecosystem of social coordination of society with millions and billions of people, intentions yield perverse outcomes, right? They result in societally destructive outcomes. And so hopefully you have an understanding of the importance of understanding unintended consequences, the role of institutions, the importance of social coordination. And I hope you're walking away from this class with a set of tools to answer the questions that you care about. And hopefully also, even if at the end of the day I have not convinced you to care about this topic, it's possible. I find that really hard to wrap my head around, particularly in the current environment where this has real implications for our lives. I hope you at least are walking away from this class feeling like basically you can, if you ask these questions consistently and correctly, you can come up with better answers for any question about the world that you have. Now, we've been applying these tools specifically to this issue here, and I don't want you to lose sight of this being our goal because we have all of the smaller pieces. But I really do hope that you're walking away from this with, and I think you are, by and large. Oh, by the way, right? Other things, MV equals PY, right? Don't want to forget that one. I mentioned that with inflation. Yeah. So we covered a lot of material. And I beat up on you a fair bit, right? Made it a little bit hard. Not because I wanted it to be hard, but because, frankly, I don't know other good ways to get this stuff. This is tricky, and it requires concentration and effort. And I hope that you feel at this point that it's paid off. Of course, at the end of the day, I'm less concerned with how you feel right now. I'm more concerned with how you are going to feel about this class and the impact it has had in your life 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. And I encourage you all to let me know. Right? If you think there are things I can do more effectively, please let me know, either with the teaching evaluations or directly via email. I also encourage you to not be a stranger. Feel free to stop in or email me if you have questions or comments or successes where you think you found an opportunity to gain insight with these tools, or areas where you're still struggling. So I hope this semester and this class has raised more questions than it has answered. I hope it has left you feeling a bit frustrated about the quality of your answers. I hope it has left you feeling curious about the world around you. And I also hope that it has left you feeling at least somewhat more prepared and equipped to engage with this discussion and to ask and get better answers to the questions that you find important. But I do hope that you walk away from this not with the understanding that what we need is more selfish behavior. I actually am of the mind that what this tells us, what this logic of economics tells us, is that we should be more concerned with altruism and social interactions and caring about others rather than less. But it also has hopefully given you an appreciation for the fact that if we rely purely upon altruism, we're going to probably not have a lot of social coordination out of the millions and billions of people. So I hope you have a sense of where you get your breakfast. I hope you have a sense of where you get your toilet paper and why most of the time it works as well as it does. I hope you also have some tools for assessing what might happen next, right? Both the short-term business cycle theory and the long-term one. And also I really hope you understand, particularly one of the big things I would encourage you to think about is the trade-off or the possible trade-off between short-term economic growth and long-run economic growth. I am of the mind that when we think about compounding growth, if we could have a larger cycle, right? So if you think about walking away from this class, it is what we have seen for the last 200 years, right? Remember, is really, if we zoomed in on economic growth over a period of time, what we've seen in countries is like this. And basically, what I care about is the trend. Now, it's possible to zoom in right here and say, oh no, this is this massive, I'm just zooming in. This is not down, it's just basically zoom in here, right? That this, when we zoom in, looks like this massive downtick. And so maybe we say, ooh, look, what we need to do is bring this up and bring this down. And that might be reasonable if what it does is get us to this. But oftentimes what happens in the process is we change the institutions and say, look, we don't want this downturn, so we're going to do away with the downturn. And what ends up happening is that we actually shift our trend downwards. So for me, what I see most of in the news is news about the cycle. And I would encourage you to at least look at the implications of policies to address the cycle, the impact that they're going to have on the trend. Because that's going to be the piece that makes a huge difference in your lifespan and the lifespan of any kids that you know and care about, right? And whether they're yours or somebody else's, right? Is that there is oftentimes a trade-off between the trend and the cycle. All right. So I hope you have at least gotten some enjoyment out of this semester. I've been very grateful for the fact that we had the first couple months to get to know each other and establish a baseline. I do encourage you, if you have suggestions for what I can do to improve my online offering, please let me know. And hopefully you'll have some questions, thoughts, reactions when we next convene for our last session. But let me just say, in advance of that, thank you all for your time, thank you all for your energy, and thank you all for your diligent consideration of your peers. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to talking with you about these issues more in the future. So take care of yourselves, and we'll talk soon.